Hi, this is Bob Weller here to talk about quantum dissonance. In this second part, we'll talk about the appearance of what I call first level harmony in the history of music. This is harmony that's based on chords which are constructed from 8-tone scales, such as this one. That's from Petrushka by Stravinsky, and this one from the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. So the purpose of this is to show where these things, the first level harmonies, start to appear in the history of music, and when the idiom changes to a 20th century idiom and the level of harmonic tension is the sort of unifying factor instead of tonal implications. So let's give a couple of examples here. Mozart, 41st Symphony. We have this chord, which is looks a lot like the Rite of Spring chord. It's kind of a variation of the Rite of Spring chord, and it is first level, based on a diminished scale, and it resolves like this. Taken out of context, sounds very 20th century, and we could play with that all day. That's 1787 for that, and typically in Mozart and in Beethoven, we usually hear this first level thing in the context of a fully diminished seventh chord, either by itself, which is first level, or over the tonic. That's a typical thing. Interestingly, the first level harmony sort of interrupts the counterpoint and interrupts the harmonic flow and signals an end to the phrase, a lot like when you're looking at Bach and you start to see parallel octaves and fifths. That slows down the harmonic motion and indicates the end of the phrase. This is much the same kind of thing. So here's another example from Mozart Dissonance Quartet, 1785. Here's the chord. That's really a 20th century chord. It only appears for a second for one quarter note, but it's really pretty gnarly for 1787. It's like an A flat triad in the bottom with an A natural in the top. And that's the opening of the Dissonance Quartet, 1785. When I was first doing this, I thought of the opening of the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which is this chord. But it turns out it's not first level. It's just has a half step in the melody, so it's kind of dissonant, and it just turns out to be a major seventh chord, but in a first inversion. The next example is by Blind Tom, who was an African-American pianist in the 1860s, and this is taken from the Battle of Manassas. And what you have is a bunch of patriotic tunes played in the right hand, and then either pedals down here like this, or sometimes it would be clusters, tone clusters, like this, which didn't really make an appearance until 35 or 40 years later in the music of Henry Cowell. So this is 1861 that this was written, Blind Tom's composition, Battle of Manassas. And there's another interesting thing about this, which is that it sort of foreshadows certain elements in cubism, the use of very dissimilar materials and making them work together. This would be something from analytical cubism, 1911 and 1913, where we take very contrasting materials that normally would not work together, and we make them work together. This is the case. You'll hear it. The patriotic melodies is a very, big contrast to the cannon fire in the left hand. It's supposed to represent cannon fire. And so here it is. This is Blind Tom, Battle of Manassas, 1861. So we'll move now to Charles Ives, American composer, who wrote a piece called Variations on America in 1891. And this is supposedly the first appearance of polytonality, which was a later 20th century practice. In other words, two different tonalities at the same time, something like that. In this case, the way it starts out with a major 7 plus 5 chord, which is kind of unusual for 1891, and then it moves to a first level chord. And if you listen to this chord, that's really a 20th century chord. That could be in any composition after 1912, 1913. But Charles Ives wrote it in 1891 when he was 17 years old. He and his father had been doing many experiments like this for years, probably since about 1880 or a little after. His father was George Ives, who was a bandmaster in the Union Army. And they used to do a lot of different experiments which were not meant for public consumption, but they were just designed to stretch the ears, such as playing in two keys at once. Let's say we played an E flat and C at the same time. That was one of their exercises. Or they had another one where they did they called drumming chords, which is where they would use a chord very similar to Stravinsky's Rite of Spring chord to do rhythms. So here's this is one of the variations in Variations on America, 1891, when Charles Ives was 17 years old. This is the organ version, which is particularly strident and does nothing to diminish the effect of these dissonances. Here it is. Okay, next I'd like to move to Central Park in the Dark, also by Charles Ives. This foreshadows cubism in several ways. The use of very contrasting material that normally would not be seen together, but he's making it work together. It starts out with a sort of a ground figure that's very mysterious. It has a programmatic element, which is a person sitting in Central Park in New York, and just listening at night to the different sounds. And the different sounds would include snatches of popular tunes, piano music, and marching bands, and all kinds of things. And so that's the programmatic aspect, and he captures it pretty well. The excerpt that we're going to hear is an example of a little later in the piece when it gets very dense. The way it starts, it's very slow moving, and he doesn't introduce a lot of contrast at first. And then in this excerpt we're going to hear, you'll hear that it gets a very high contrast kind of collage effect. And as I said, this is 1906, and nobody else was doing anything like this in 1906. So here it is, Central Park in the Dark, Charles Ives. Okay, shortly after this, 1909 was sort of a watershed year for first level harmony, which we're talking about. There was Erwartung by Arnold Schoenberg and 5 pieces for orchestra, also by Schoenberg, and a number of other great pieces. Well, there was The Unanswered Question by Charles Ives, that's 1909. And in 1910, even Mahler, Gustav Mahler, was getting in on the new harmony. Here's a harmony from his unfinished 10th Symphony, and this takes a second for me to play because it's too big to play with 2 hands. So here it is. There it is. That's the opening of the 10th Symphony, and that's a second level chord. In other words, it requires more notes than a first level chord to make it comprehensible. In this case, it turns out to be a whole tone scale plus 2 extra notes, which is a second level harmony. Finally, we get to Petrushka. This is by Stravinsky in 1911. We get to the Petrushka chord, which is a C major over F major. That's Petrushka's leitmotif. Various permutations of that. And in addition to that, which is a first level sound, there are a lot of other first level sounds, and there are also a lot of tonal sounds. For example, the way it opens, it's sort of a accordion-like effect. So it's mixed tonality and first level harmony in Petrushka, almost like he was checking out the first level harmony to see if it would stand, which it did. Petrushka was wildly popular and made his reputation as a man of the theater in Paris. Then he finally moved to the Rite of Spring, which would be 1912 to 1913, in which he pulled out all the stops and used a number of different first level harmonies. In fact, the entire thing is based on first level harmonies, and that's really the organizing principle of it. We have, like, for example, the Rite of Spring chord, which I talked about, this, which is an 8-tone scale, and we also have this one, which you can see is B major and B minor at the same time, which is, this turns out to be a cubist metaphor for simultaneity. And there's 5 videos, if you want to look at them on YouTube, about Stravinsky and cubism. That's another one. And there were a lot of others. Mostly it was about this parallel modality we have here, major and minor at the same time, or it would be triads separated by, in this case, a tritone, or other various combinations of notes. But if you look at the Rite of Spring carefully, and if you go through it, it's clear that the harmony is very consistently first level almost all the way through. There are exceptions, such as that section in E flat Dorian, which eventually turns into this. So it moves from 0 level, or a tonal explanation, to this first level sound with very little warning. And that's typical of the Rite of Spring, the startling contrasts, the ideas of discontinuity and fragmentation, and other ideas, primitivism, that were part of the Rite, and they were part of analytical cubism, which Stravinsky was very familiar with at that point. So if you'd like to check this out a little more, I suggest you check out the book, Stravinsky and Cubism, or it's fairly technical, so if you don't want to do that, you can look at the videos online. There's 5 videos entitled Stravinsky and Cubism, in addition to these 2. So thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.